The wind came from the northwest, like something that had made up its mind. It was the third week of January, 1887, and the Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri were locked inside a cold so severe that local accounts would later describe it simply as a punishment. The kind of winter that empties a region of its arrogance and reminds every man, woman, and child that they are guests on this land, not owners of it. By midnight, the temperature outside had fallen to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. In the valley below Callaway Ridge, the log cabins that families had spent the last 2 summers building were losing ground fast. Inside the Dunbar homestead, a well-chinked, 2-room structure with a decent stone hearth, the interior had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius by 3 in the morning, despite a fire that had burned steadily since supper. Calvin Dunbar would later tell a visiting land surveyor that he had burned through nearly an entire cord of split oak in a single night and still woke to find frost on the inside of his window glass. For 100 yards up the ridge, tucked into the south-facing slope of a limestone bluff, something entirely different was happening. Inside a shelter that most of Callaway Ridge had called foolish, a dugout, a hole, an embarrassment, the air temperature held at 84 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. A single fire, set at dusk and left to die on its own, had been enough. The 2 children sleeping on the earthen shelf along the rear wall had kicked off their wool blankets sometime in the night. The woman who had built that shelter was not asleep. She was sitting near the low entrance tunnel with a small oil lamp, listening to the wind fail to enter. Her name was Mabel Croft. She was 31 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had built every inch of that shelter herself. Before we go back to that January night, before we find out exactly how she did it, and what the neighbors said when she started digging, if this kind of forgotten frontier engineering is what you come here for, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We travel far and wide through history, and we want to know who's making the journey with us. The summer of 1886 arrived generously in the Ozark Plateau. The limestone bluffs ran ochre and pale gray above the tree line, and the creek bottoms were thick with black walnut, white oak, and the kind of silence that only exists far from a railroad. This was the landscape Mabel Croft entered in late June of that year, coming down from the Illinois side of the river with a wagon, 2 children, Della, age 9, and Roy, age 7, and a range of practical skills that her neighbors would spend the next 6 months systematically underestimating. Her husband, James Croft, had died the previous spring of a lung infection that took him in 8 days. He had left her a land patent for 80 acres on the south slope of Callaway Ridge, a small sum of money, and a detailed letter describing the timber, the water table, and the approximate location of a limestone shelf he had scouted the prior autumn. James had been a methodical man. His widow was more so. The ridge sat at roughly 1,600 feet elevation in Ozark County, close enough to the Arkansas border to share its weather patterns, which meant winters that could arrive suddenly in October and stay unmoved through March. The average January low in that region during the 1880s ran between 10 degrees Fahrenheit and 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius to minus 8 degrees Celsius. But 1886 was not an average year. The summer had been dry and blazing, the kind that old-timers read as a sign. When the barometric pressure began dropping in late November, the men on the ridge started cutting with an urgency that felt different from routine. Mabel had arrived in June with 4 months before the first frost. She knew, with the clear arithmetic of someone who had calculated everything she owned, that she could not build a standard log cabin in that time. Not alone, not to the standard that would keep her children alive through a hard winter. The timber would need to be felled, limbed, skidded down the slope, notched, stacked, and chinked. A proper 2-room cabin required at minimum 120 to 140 logs of usable length. She had no draft animal and no money to hire one, so she looked at what she did have. She had 80 acres of hillside. She had limestone everywhere. She had a south-facing slope that caught full sun from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She had 2 children who could carry stone. And she had James's letter, which mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a natural overhang near the upper tree line where the rock had fractured and pulled away from the bluff. A shallow cave, maybe 6 feet deep, with a dry earthen floor. Mabel Croft walked up to that overhang on her third day on the ridge. She stood inside it for a long time. Then she took out a folded piece of paper and began to draw. To understand what Mabel was thinking as she sketched inside that limestone overhang, you need to understand the fundamental failure of the standard frontier cabin. Not as a romantic image, but as a thermal machine. A typical Ozark homestead cabin of the 1880s was built from green-cut hardwood logs, stacked horizontally and notched at the corners. Wall thickness ran between 6 and 9 inches of solid wood. Gaps between logs were chinked with a mixture of mud, clay, animal hair, and with chips, a process that required constant maintenance, because the logs continued to shrink and shift for years after construction. A well-built cabin, properly chinked, offered reasonable protection in temperatures down to around 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius with a good fire burning. Below that threshold, the physics began working against the structure in ways that most settlers simply accepted as the cost of frontier life. The core problem was mass. Wood is a poor thermal storage material. It conducts heat readily and holds almost none of it. A log wall, once the fire inside dies down, loses its warmth to the exterior in a matter of hours. The standard single-stone hearth of the era, a shallow firebox set into one wall with a vertical flue, radiated heat intensely in one direction for as long as the fire burned, then went cold almost immediately when the fuel was exhausted. Frontier families in hard winters reported burning between 5 and 8 cords of wood per season, with interior temperatures still dropping to mid-30th degree F, 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, before morning. The draft problem compounded everything. A vertical flue creates a strong updraft that pulls enormous volumes of heated room air up and out of the structure. Some account for the error suggest that a roaring open hearth fire in a poorly sealed cabin was actually cooling the living space by drawing cold exterior air through every gap in the chinking. You were, in essence, burning wood to create a draft that sucked the heat out faster than the fire could replace it. Mabel had lived this problem the winter before James died. Their Illinois farmhouse had a similar hearth, and she remembered how the warmth pooled only in a narrow band directly in front of the fire, how the children's beds, 6 feet away, were cold enough to see their breath. She remembered calculating one night that they had burned a cord and a quarter of hickory in 11 days, and the bedroom still went below 40 degrees Fahrenheit 4 degrees Celsius every morning before dawn. What the log cabin could not do, no matter how well it was built, was store heat. It could only generate it and immediately begin losing it. That was the problem Mabel intended to solve. There is a moment in the development of any practical idea when observation outpaces theory, when what a person sees with their own body overrides everything they've been told by people who have never looked carefully enough. For Mabel Croft, that moment came in late July of 1886, on a day when the temperature in the open meadow above the ridge reached 97 degrees Fahrenheit 36 degrees Celsius. She had taken Della and Roy up to gather service berries along the upper bluff line when a thunderstorm moved in faster than she expected. They sheltered in a limestone overhang, the same one she had already begun studying, for nearly 2 hours while the storm passed. The air outside was charged and hot. Inside the overhang, within 3 feet of the rock face, the temperature was noticeably, measurably cooler, not dramatically, perhaps 14 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, lower than outside, but enough that Roy stopped complaining about the heat and Della fell asleep against the stone wall. Mabel sat very still and paid attention. The stone was not just cooler. It was actively releasing cool air, or more precisely, it was absorbing the heat from her skin and the air around her, the way a cast iron skillet absorbs heat from a flame. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone and held it there. The rock was cool at the surface and, she suspected, considerably cooler 2 or 3 inches inside the face. The earth behind it, she knew from the exposed profile at the base of the bluff, went back at least 12 feet before hitting a solid formation. That earth, insulated by 20 feet of limestone above it and never touched by direct sun or wind, will hold a near constant temperature year-round, likely somewhere between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, the natural equilibrium of undisturbed soil at that latitude and elevation. She had seen this principle at work before, though she had never named it. Root cellars used it. The best ones stayed between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. 0 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, all winter, not because they were refrigerated, but because the earth around them resisted temperature change. Animal burrows stayed unfrozen. The deepest part of a riverbank never froze, even in January. The ground itself was a thermal battery, slow to charge, slow to discharge, and capable of holding a temperature for months without any fuel at all. What Mabel began to see, sitting in that overhang while the storm shook the trees outside, was a reversal of the cabin problem. A log cabin tried to generate heat in an environment designed to lose it. A structure built into the earth would start from a baseline of 52 degrees Fahrenheit to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, and need only a fraction of the fuel to raise that space to a comfortable sleeping temperature. The mass of the earth and stone would absorb the heat from a small fire and release it slowly, over 6, 8, 10 hours, long after the fire itself had died. She did not have a thermometer. She did not have a textbook. She had a dead husband's land patent, 2 children, and 40 years of frontier common sense distilled into a single, clear question she wrote in the margin of James's letter that evening. Whether the shelter is a stone and the fire is just a push it needs? It was the right question. What she did with it, and what the men on Callaway Ridge said when they saw her start digging, is the part of the story that tends to surprise people. And that is exactly where we're going next. But before we get there, if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us where you're from. Tell us if you've ever seen a structure like this. Because more people have ancestors who built this way than most of us realize. We'll see you in the next chapter. The neighbors first noticed in early August, when the sound of iron striking limestone carried down the ridge on a still morning. Mabel had chosen her entry point with care. The natural overhang sat near the top of the south-facing slope, roughly 30 feet above the tree line, where the bluff face had fractured along a horizontal seam and left a shallow recess approximately 6 feet deep, 9 feet wide, and 5.5 feet tall at the highest point of its ceiling. The existing cavity was not large enough to live in, but it was a beginning, a structural gift from the geology itself. A preformed ceiling of solid limestone 2 feet thick, with 12 feet of compacted earth and rock above it. No human hand would ever need to support that roof. The mountain was already doing it. Mabel's plan, drawn in pencil across the back of 2 pages torn from James's ledger book, showed the expansion of the natural recess into a habitable space roughly 14 feet deep and 11 feet wide, an interior floor area of approximately 154 square feet, which was not generous, but was comparable to the single-room frontier cabins that most families on the ridge were living in that same summer. The difference was everything beneath the surface. She began by excavating the floor, using a steel mattock, a long-handled shovel, and a hand auger she had traded for in the nearest town. She and the 2 children spent the first 3 weeks of August removing earth from the existing recess, pushing the back wall deeper into the hillside at a slight downward angle, descending roughly 8 inches over 14-foot depth of the shelter. This was deliberate. Cold air is denser than warm air and sinks. A floor that sloped downward toward the rear of the shelter will allow any cold air that entered the front to drain toward the back and away from the sleeping area, while warm air from the fire rose and remained concentrated in the upper portion of the living space near the entrance. The entrance itself was the most unconventional element of the design, and the one that drew the most immediate ridicule. Rather than a standard door set flush with the hillside, Mabel excavated a tunnel entrance, 4 feet high, 2.5 feet wide, and 6 feet long, that angled slightly downward before rising into the main chamber. Anyone entering the shelter had to duck and step down, then step up. It looked, to the men who came to observe, like the entrance to an animal den. That comparison was not inaccurate. It was also, as Mabel understood perfectly, a cold trap. Cold air pooling outside could not simply flow into the shelter the way it would through a vertical door. It had to travel down into the low point of the tunnel where it stalled and then travel upward against its own natural tendency to sink before it could reach the living space. In practice, this entrance geometry reduced cold air infiltration by a significant margin compared to a standard door, especially during high wind conditions. The floor of the shelter was laid with flat sandstone slabs, each weighing between 40 and 90 pounds, sourced from a natural outcrop 200 yards down the slope. Mabel and the children moved them by hand, one at a time, over the course of nearly 2 weeks. The slabs were set directly on the compacted earth subfloor, fitted as tightly as their irregular shapes allowed, and the gaps between them were packed with a mixture of clay and wood ash, a combination that hardened like rough mortar when it dried. When complete, the sandstone floor represented approximately 4,200 pounds of dense stone, sitting on top of the natural earth and in direct thermal contact with the ground beneath it. During the day, when the fire burned, those slabs would absorb heat steadily. At night, they would release it slowly back into the air, functioning, in effect, as a radiant floor that continued warming the shelter for 6 to 10 hours after the last log had burned to ash. The rear wall, the deepest point of the excavation, where the earth met solid limestone, was built up with a double course of stacked fieldstone, dry laid without mortar, rising 4 feet from the floor and continuing the full 11-foot width of the chamber. Behind this wall, Mabel left a gap of approximately 8 inches between the stonework and the raw earth face of the excavation. This was where the firebox would sit. The firebox was a low, wide structure, not the tall, vertical hearth common to log cabins of the era, but a broad, shallow box of flat limestone slabs roughly 18 inches tall, 30 inches wide, and 20 inches deep, set into the rear wall cavity with its opening facing into the living space. The geometry was critical. A tall firebox sends most of its heat directly up the flue and out of the shelter. A low, wide firebox spreads its radiant surface across a broader area of the rear wall and allows the stone mass behind it to absorb heat rather than vent it. Mabel had observed this principle, without naming it as such, in the way that a shallow stone fire pit in the open air kept the camp warm long after the fire died, compared to a tall ring of stacked rock that directed all its heat upward. Above the firebox, she constructed a simple angle flue using flat limestone slabs, rising to the rear wall and exiting through a small opening she had chiseled near the top of the bluff face, 22 feet above the shelter floor. The long flue run, far longer than any standard cabin chimney, created a moderate draft that drew smoke out reliably without pulling excessive volumes of heated room air with it. A short chimney creates a violent draft. A long chimney creates a controlled one. The ceiling of a natural overhang was left entirely in place. Mabel added no framing, no boards, no batting. The raw limestone above the living space was the ceiling. 18 inches of undisturbed earth and root system lay above it. Above that, another 14 feet of hillside. The shelter was not insulated in the modern sense. It was buried, and burial is older and more effective than insulation. By late September, the shelter was complete enough to move into. The entrance was fitted with a heavy wool blanket on an interior rod, the first layer of a 2-layer cold trap that Mabel finished in October by adding a second blanket at the inner end of the tunnel. The sandstone floor was swept clean. A low earthen bench ran along both side walls, raised 18 inches above the floor and packed hard, covered with pine boughs and the family's wool blankets. Roy helped Mabel stack the wood supply just outside the entrance, under a small lean-to of pine poles and bark that protected the fuel from snow, while keeping it close enough to carry in without crossing exposed ground. On the last day of September, Mabel lit a fire in the new firebox for the first time. It took 4 hours for the rear wall to become warm to the touch. By the 7th hour, the sandstone floor near the rear of the shelter was radiating heat that Della described, in a letter written years later, as feeling like standing near a cookstove from 2 feet away, except the warmth came from everywhere at once. The shelter was ready. The winter was not yet. Word travels fast on a ridge where there are fewer than 20 families, and not much else to discuss between the last harvest and the first hard freeze. By the time Mabel's excavation was finished and her flue smoke was visible above the bluff line, Callaway Ridge had formed a firm and largely unanimous opinion on the matter. It was not a favorable one. The most vocal critic was a man named Silas Pemberton, who had been building and repairing log structures in Ozark County for going on 22 years and considered himself, with some justification, the most experienced construction authority within a day's ride. Silas had built 4 of the 7 cabins currently occupied on the ridge, including the Dunbar homestead, and he had walked up the slope in early September to inspect Mabel's work with the expression of a man who had been asked to evaluate something mildly offensive. He stood at the tunnel entrance for a long time without speaking. Then he said that the whole thing would be underwater by spring, because hillside drainage always found its way into any excavation that foolish, and he had seen it a dozen times. He said the flue was too long and would never draw properly, and the firebox was too low and would smoke out the interior. He said the damp earth would rot the children's lungs before February. He said a widow alone on a ridge in that country had no business trying to reinvent what people had been doing with log and mortar for 100 years. He was not entirely wrong about any single technical point he raised. Hillside drainage is a real hazard. Flue geometry matters. Moisture in an enclosed earthen space is a legitimate concern. But Silas Pemberton was reasoning from the failure mode of excavations he had seen done carelessly, without attention to drainage slopes, without a long flue run, without the particular combination of stone mass and ventilation geometry that Mabel had worked out over the course of a summer's observation. He was cataloging the ways the idea could fail, without examining the specific ways his version of it had been designed not to. The other men on the ridge mostly agreed with Silas, with varying degrees of conviction. Calvin Dunbar said he respected the woman's grit, but thought she was making a hard situation harder by refusing to accept help building a proper cabin. Two brothers named Whitfield, who had arrived the previous spring from Tennessee, said they had heard of dugouts working well enough on the open plains, but that hillside excavations were a different matter entirely, and nobody they knew of had done it successfully in hill country. The women on the ridge were more divided. Clara Dunbar brought Mabel a jar of preserved tomatoes and asked careful questions about the floor drainage and the sleeping bench heights. Margaret Whitfield said nothing, but she came back twice to walk to the completed shelter before the cold arrived, running her hand along the rear wall and the sandstone floor with an expression that was more calculating than polite. The hardest moment came from Roy. He was 7 years old and had spent enough time listening to adult conversations to have absorbed, imperfectly but effectively, the community's consensus on his mother's project. One evening in early October, sitting on the earthen bench while Mabel banked the fire for the night, he asked her, with the directness of a child who does not yet know how to soften a question, whether she was sure the shelter would not collapse on them while they were sleeping. Mabel sat down beside him and looked at the limestone ceiling for a moment. She told him that the stone above them had been holding up that hill since before any person alive could remember, and that it would still be holding it up long after they were gone. She told him that the men on the ridge were good builders who knew a great deal about wood, and that was what they used because it was what they knew. She told him that she was using stone and earth because that was what the hill was made of, and it made more sense to work with what was already there than to fight it. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if the fire really worked the way she said it did, if the floor really stayed warm after the fire went out. Mabel pressed his small hand flat against the sandstone slab beside his foot, which had been absorbing heat for 6 hours. He held it there for a moment. Then he nodded, in the way that children nod when something abstract becomes suddenly and completely real. He did not ask again. December of 1886 arrived in the Ozark Highlands, without warning and without mercy. The first hard freeze came on the 8th of the month, driving temperatures to 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius overnight, a full 3 weeks earlier than the regional average. The creek at the bottom of the valley froze solid in 48 hours. The Whitfield brothers, who had not yet finished their chinking, spent 2 days working to the night to pack the gaps in their walls with strips of burlap soaked in clay water. Calvin Dunbar tripled his consumption in the first 2 weeks of December and wrote in his journal, a document that regional historians would examine decades later, that it burned through a full cord of split oak between the 1st and the 15th, and his bedroom wall was still cold enough to store meat against it. Then, on the night of January 14th, the real cold came. A pressure system that weather observers in St. Louis described as the most severe to cross the central United States in half a century drove temperatures across the Ozark Plateau to between minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit and minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius to minus 31 degrees Celsius. By 2 in the morning, the wind came with it, sustained at 20 to 25 miles per hour from the northwest, gusting to 40, driving the effective wind chill to values that no thermometer of the era was designed to measure. Trees cracked in the dark like rifle shots. The creek did not just freeze. It froze so solid that Silas Pemberton's dog, which had been sleeping under the porch, was found the following morning pressed against the foundation stones, unable to stand. In the log cabins of Callaway Ridge, the night of January 14th to 15th became a fixed point in the community's collective memory, a before and after line that separated the way people talked about winter from the way they actually survived it. Calvin Dunbar's interior temperature, recorded at 3 a.m. by a small mercury thermometer he kept on a nail above the hearth, dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius, despite a fire that he fed continuously since 10 o'clock. He reported burning through nearly 3/4 of a cord in a single night. The Whitfield brothers, in their partially chinked cabin, saw temperatures inside reach 29 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius by dawn, below freezing, inside a structure with an active fire. The younger brother, Garrett Whitfield, suffered frostbite to 3 fingers on his right hand during the night. His water barrel, set 4 feet from the hearth, froze through. Up on the slope, behind a limestone bluff, Mabel Croft had set her fire at sundown and let it burn for 4 hours before banking it with ash and going to sleep. At 3 in the morning, the same hour that Calvin Dunbar was recording 34 degrees Fahrenheit inside his hearth-warm cabin, Mabel's shelter held at 84 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. The mechanism was not mysterious. It was thermal mass, operating exactly as the physics demanded. The 4,200 pounds of sandstone floor, heated through the afternoon and evening fire, was radiating stored energy back into the air at a rate slow enough to sustain warmth for 8 to 12 hours after the fire itself had died. The rear wall, 12 feet of stacked fieldstone backed by compacted earth, had absorbed heat through the firebox cavity all evening and was releasing it in a slow, even gradient across its entire surface area. The ceiling of raw limestone, 2 feet thick with nearly 15 feet of hillside above it, had never dropped below 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, and was actively warming the air that rose to touch it, rather than cooling it. The tunnel entrance, with its 2 wool curtains and its descending geometry, was admitting almost no outside air. The shelter was not fighting the cold. It had made the cold irrelevant. The contrast with consumption was a number that no one on Callaway Ridge could argue past. Mabel had burned, over the entire month of January, approximately 1 cord and 1/4 of mixed hardwood, primarily oak and hickory, split to 4-inch diameter for the low firebox. Calvin Dunbar, in his well-built log cabin of similar interior square footage, burned through 4 cords and 3/4 in the same period. The Whitfield brothers, in their improperly sealed structure, consumed more than 6 cords and still recorded interior temperatures 20 degrees colder than Mabel's shelter on the worst nights. Put another way, Mabel's shelter used roughly 1/4 of the fuel that a standard log cabin consumed and maintained an interior temperature that was, on the coldest recorded night of the winter, approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius warmer than the best conventional structure on the ridge. Silas Pemberton visited on the morning of January 16th, after the worst of the cold had passed. He walked through the tunnel entrance, stood in the shelter for a long moment, and pressed both palms flat against the rear wall and then the floor. He said nothing for a while. Then he asked Mabel, in a tone that had lost most of its authority, exactly what angle she had used for the entrance tunnel. She told him. She told him about the floor slope, the firebox geometry, the flue length, and the stone selection criteria, the dense sandstone for the floor, the fieldstone for the rear wall, the importance of the gap between the stacked wall face and the raw earth behind it. She answered every question he asked. She did not say "I told you so," because it was not in her character, and because the sandstone floor was still warm under their feet, and the fact spoke well enough for itself. By the spring thaw of 1887, 3 families on Callaway Ridge had asked Mabel Croft to walk their land with them. They were not asking for her permission. They were asking for her eye, for the specific, observational intelligence that had looked at a limestone overhang on a south-facing slope and seen not a curiosity but a solution. Calvin Dunbar wanted to know if the hillside behind his existing cabin had a suitable formation. The Whitfield brothers, Garrett and Owen, were thinking of abandoning their current site entirely and moving upslope to a bluff formation they had noticed the previous autumn. Margaret Whitfield, who had asked no one's opinion and said very little the entire winter, had already begun drawing her own plans. Oral accounts collected from the region in the decades that followed, preserved in county histories, and a brief mention in an 1894 agricultural extension report on vernacular construction, in the Missouri Ozarks, describe at least 9 semi-subterranean shelters in the Callaway Ridge area by 1895. Several were built as primary winter residences. Others were constructed as supplemental sleeping structures adjacent to existing log cabins, used specifically during the coldest weeks of winter, when the thermal advantage of the earthen design was most pronounced. Local accounts suggest that the families who adopted the technique consistently reported with savings of between 60 and 75% compared to their previous cabin winters, numbers plausible enough to explain why the idea spread as quickly as it did among people for whom fuel represented both labor and money. Silas Pemberton built one himself in 1889. Oral tradition holds that he built it well. What Mabel Croft understood, and what the men on the ridge initially failed to grasp, was not a secret. It was not magic. It was a principle that the earth had been demonstrating since the first human beings sheltered in a cave and noticed that the stone walls stayed warm long after the fire went out. The Anasazi cliff dwellers of the American Southwest had built their stone cities into south-facing canyon walls for precisely this reason, harvesting passive solar energy through thermal mass centuries before any European colonists set foot on the continent. The Norse longhouses of Scandinavia were half buried in sod for the same thermal logic. The Bara shelters of the Aleutian Islands, semi-subterranean structures of driftwood and earth that indigenous communities have refined over generations, maintain livable temperatures through subarctic winters with minimal fuel. The Airori heart tradition of rural Japan positioned a low, central fire pit flush with the floor for maximum radiant contact with the surrounding stone and earth. Not a roaring vertical blaze sending heat up a chimney, but a slow, controlled burn that charged the floor and walls the way you charge a battery. Mabel had arrived at the same conclusion these traditions had reached, independently through observation and necessity. She had not reinvented the wheel. She had rediscovered it. In a limestone overhang on a Missouri ridge, on a hot July afternoon, with her children asleep beside her and a storm moving through the trees, the principle she used has a name in modern building science: thermal mass. It describes the capacity of a dense material, stone, earth, concrete, water, to absorb heat energy, store it, and release it slowly over time, smoothing out temperature fluctuations and reducing the energy required to maintain a stable interior environment. Contemporary passive solar design standards recommend that properly sized thermal mass can reduce heating energy requirements by 30 to 60% in a well-designed structure. Mabel's shelter, by the evidence of that January, was performing at a higher end of that range, without a single concept from any textbook, without a licensed engineer, and without anything more sophisticated than a steel mattock, a pencil, and the kind of attention that comes from having no margin for error. The shelter stood on Callaway Ridge for at least 30 years after the winter of 1887. A brief notation in an Ozark County land record from 1919 describes a property transfer that references the old stone dugout on the south face as a boundary marker, suggesting the structure was still a recognized landmark more than 3 decades after Mabel built it. What became of Mabel herself? Whether she stayed on the ridge, whether she remarried, whether Dell and Roy carried the knowledge of that shelter into their own lives, the historical record does not clearly say. Local oral tradition, as recorded by a county historian in the 1930s, describes her simply as a woman who built a warm house in a hill, which is, in its way, a more durable monument than most people leave behind. The cold that tested her shelter in January of 1887 was, by every regional account, the most severe in living memory. It broke records. It ended lives. It emptied cabins that experienced builders it considered adequate, and it exposed, in the most unforgiving possible way, the difference between a structure designed around the materials available and a structure designed around the physics of heat itself. One shelter, on a south-facing limestone slope, held above 84 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst of it. The woman who built it had never heard the term thermal mass. She just understood, with a precision that no title or credential could have sharpened, that stone remembers warmth, and that if you get enough of the right kind of fire, it will keep your children alive until morning. If this story stayed with you, if there is something in the engineering of forgotten places that still speaks to you, the way it spoke to Mabel Croft standing inside a limestone overhang in the summer of 1886, then you already know what to do. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what piece of this history you want us to dig into next. Because there are more stories like this one, more shelters, more solutions that the modern world forgot, and that are still waiting, buried in a hillside somewhere, for someone patient enough to look. We will be here when you are ready. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.